I was folding my sister-in-law's lace underwear when I found the receipt for the jewelry box. The one my husband told me was a family heirloom he'd recovered from his mother's estate. The date on the thermal paper was 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday, the same afternoon he told me he was stuck in a budget meeting at the firm. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the silk slip in my lap feeling suddenly like lead. Our home in the damp, gray suburbs of Seattle always felt a little too quiet, but now the silence had a teeth-gritting edge to it. Through the floorboards, I could hear the rhythmic thump-thump of Kalen in the garage, hammering away at a woodworking project he didn't have the patience for. He'd been like that for months, fidgety, performing the role of the handy husband, while the foundation of our marriage quietly eroded. My sister-in-law, Sloane, was staying with us until she got on her feet. That was 4 months ago. She was Kalen's younger sister, the golden child who smelled of expensive cigarettes and expensive mistakes. She arrived with 3 suitcases and a trail of debt, and I, the dutiful wife, had spent my weekends scrubbing her wine stains out of my linen sofa. I looked at the receipt again, $1,200, paid in cash. The jewelry box sat on my dresser upstairs. It was a beautiful, dark mahogany piece with velvet lining. When Kalen gave it to me, he'd looked me in the eyes with a softness that made me feel guilty for ever doubting him. "My mother wanted you to have this, Tamsin," he'd whispered. "She knew you were the only one who would truly take care of it." I had cried. I had thanked him for seeing me, for valuing the way I held our lives together while he navigated his career transition. But the receipt wasn't for the mahogany box. I turned the crumpled paper over. It was for a gold filigree locket with emerald inlay. I didn't own a locket. I stood up, my knees stiff. I walked to the guest closet where Sloane kept her jewelry tree, a tangled mess of cheap brass and silver. And there, hanging prominently in the center, was the green flash of an emerald. It was heavy, vintage-styled, and utterly beautiful. "Tamsin, you in there." The voice was light, airy, and sent a shiver of cold through my chest. Sloane was standing in the doorway, her hair damp from a shower, wrapped in one of my oversized plush robes. She looked at the laundry basket, then at me, her eyes flickering to the receipt still gripped in my hand. For a second, the mask slipped. Her face didn't show guilt. It showed a sharp, predatory calculation. Then, just as quickly, she softened. "Oh, you found that," she said, stepping into the room and gently taking the receipt from my fingers. She didn't snatch it. She took it like a nurse taking a dangerous object from a child. "I asked Kalen to pick that up for me. I'm selling some old pieces to pay back the first month of rent I owe you guys. He was just helping me get an appraisal." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She smelled like my expensive shampoo and something metallic. "He didn't want to tell you because he knew you'd insist I keep the money," she continued, patting my arm. "You're too good to us, Tamsin, honestly, a saint." She moved past me to the closet, tucked the locket inside her robe pocket, and hummed a low, tuneless song. I stood in the center of the room, the smell of her floral perfume clashing with the scent of the rain-damp cedar coming from the garage. I didn't believe her. I realized then that I hadn't believed a word that had come out of either of their mouths for a very long time. I looked at the laundry basket, the domesticity I had curated so carefully, and felt a sudden, violent urge to throw it all out the window. Instead, I smoothed my skirt. "Dinner at 6, Sloane," I said, my voice steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't be late. Kalen hates it when the roast gets cold." I walked out, but as I passed the hallway mirror, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked like a stranger who had been invited into her own life, only to realize she was the help. I went downstairs to the kitchen. I picked up the chef's knife to start the carrots, but my hand was shaking so hard the blade rattled against the wooden board. I heard the garage door creak open. Kalen was coming inside. He'd have sawdust in his hair and that tired, hard-working slump in his shoulders. He'd kiss my cheek and ask how my day was. And for the first time in 7 years, I was going to lie to him. I was going to lie until I found out exactly how much of my life was a fiction. Kalen entered the kitchen exactly as I'd imagined, a fine dusting of pine over his shoulders like a layer of unearned virtue. He walked up behind me while I was still staring at the carrots, pressing his chest against my back. It was a gesture that used to feel like a sanctuary. Now, it felt like being pinned down. "Smells good, Tam," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "You okay? You look a little stiff." "Just a long day," I said, forcing my hand to steady. I sliced through a carrot with a sharp, decisive thwack. "The humidity is making my joints ache. How's the cabinet coming along?" "Slow, the wood is stubborn." He reached over me to grab a glass, his arm brushing mine. "Sloane around." "She's upstairs," I replied, keeping my eyes on the knife. "She said you helped her with an appraisal today, for a locket." I felt the shift in him immediately. It wasn't a flinch. It was a stillness, the kind a deer adopts when it hears a twig snap. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thin, the hum of the refrigerator growing deafeningly loud. "Oh, yeah," he said, his voice dropping an octave into that easy, casual tone he used when he was navigating a difficult client. "She's finally trying to be responsible. I didn't want to bring it up because, well, you know Sloane. If it doesn't pan out, she'll get embarrassed and mope for a week. I was trying to spare you the drama." "That's thoughtful of you," I said. I turned to look at him. He looked perfect. His jaw was square, his eyes a clear, honest hazel. He looked like the man I had sacrificed my career for so we could move across the country for his big break. The one that had evaporated into consulting work 3 months after we arrived. "I'm just glad she's contributing," he added, taking a sip of water. "Every little bit helps with the mortgage, right?" He smiled, and for a split second I saw the ghost of the man I loved. But then I remembered the receipt, $1,200, paid in cash. Kaylin hadn't had a paycheck deposit in 6 weeks. We had been living off my dwindling freelance editing income and the emergency fund my father had left me. If he had $1,200 in cash to buy Sloane a locket, that money hadn't come from a budget meeting. It had come from us. "Right," I whispered. Dinner was a master class in psychological theater. Sloane joined us, having changed into a silk slip dress that was far too thin for a chilly Tuesday night. She sat across from Kaylin, and I watched them, not with the eyes of a wife, but with the eyes of a hunter. I noticed the way their knees almost brushed under the small table. I noticed how Kaylin laughed a little too loudly at her jokes about her disastrous ex-boyfriend in London. But mostly, I noticed the silence between them when I wasn't speaking. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable, shared intimacy. "Tamsin, you're barely eating," Sloane said, swirling a piece of roast in the gravy. "Is the salt bothering you? I know you've been stressed lately." "I'm fine, Sloane, just thinking about the guest room," I said, leaning back. "I think it's time we turned it into a proper office. My work is picking up and I need the space." The fork in Kaylin's hand paused halfway to his mouth. Sloane's eyes sharpened. "An office," Kaylin cleared his throat. "But where would Sloane go? We talked about this, Tam. She needs a stable environment to get her life back on track." "She's been here 4 months, Kaylin," I said, my voice sweet, conversational. "And if she's selling her jewelry and getting on her feet, she won't need our spare room much longer. Right, Sloane." Sloane set her fork down. The golden child pout began to form on her lips. "I thought we were family, Tamsin. I didn't realize I was an inconvenience." "You're not an inconvenience," I replied, my gaze level. "You're an adult, and I'm sure you don't want to spend your 30s sleeping in your brother's guest wing." I saw the look they exchanged, a quick, flickering pulse of panic that passed between them like a secret note. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. That night, I lay in bed next to Kaylin, listening to his rhythmic, faked breathing. He was awake. He was waiting for me to fall asleep. I waited. I made my breath heavy and slow. An hour later, he moved. He slid out of bed with practiced silence, the floorboards barely groaning under his weight. He didn't head for the bathroom. He headed for the door. I counted to 30, then I stood up, my bare feet cold on the hardwood. I crept to the top of the stairs. The house was pitch black, save for a thin sliver of light spilling out from under the guest room door. I moved closer, pressing my ear to the wood. "She's suspicious," I heard Sloane whisper, her voice devoid of its usual airy charm. It was hard, cold. The office thing, she's trying to push me out. She's just tired, Kaylin's voice replied, sounding smaller than I'd ever heard it. I'll handle her. Just keep the locket out of sight. If she finds out where that money actually came from, we're both dead. You better, Sloane hissed. Because I'm not going back to that apartment, Kaylin, and I'm not losing this. I backed away, my hand over my mouth. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had turned into a cold stone in my chest. They weren't just betraying me. They were conspiring against me in the house I paid for. I walked back to our bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the mahogany jewelry box on my dresser. I opened it. The velvet inside was empty, waiting for the heirlooms that didn't exist. I realized then that if I was going to lose my home and my marriage, I wasn't going to go quietly. I was going to wait. I was going to watch. And I was going to find out exactly what money Kaylin was talking about. Because the only thing left in our joint account was $3,000, and I had checked it this morning. It was still there. Which meant Kaylin was getting money from somewhere else. Or someone else. The next morning, the house felt like a stage set where the actors had forgotten their lines. Kaylin was extra attentive, lingering over his coffee and offering to take the car in for its oil change, a task I'd been nagging him about for weeks. Sloane remained in her room, the door pointedly shut, claiming a migraine brought on by the stress of her job search. I watched him leave from the kitchen window, his taillights disappearing into the Seattle mist. The moment he was gone, the silence of the house became an ally. I didn't go for his computer. Kaylin was tech-savvy enough to use private browsers. I went for the garage. Kaylin's workshop was a graveyard of half-finished projects, shelves that weren't level, chairs with wobbling legs. He liked the idea of being a craftsman, the rugged aesthetic of it, but he lacked the discipline for the details. I started with his workbench, moving aside jars of rusted nails and cans of dried varnish. Hidden behind a stack of warped plywood was a locked metal filing box. I knew where the key was. Kaylin kept a decoy key ring in a magnetic box under the lawnmower. It was a classic move of a man who thought he was much smarter than the people around him. My hands were steady as I retrieved it. My heart felt oddly clinical, as if I were performing surgery on my own life. The lock clicked open. Inside weren't just bank statements. There were envelopes, thick, manila ones addressed to a name I didn't recognize, Vance Heiress. I pulled out the top document. It was a life insurance policy. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. It was a policy on my life, taken out 3 years ago, shortly after we moved. But the beneficiary wasn't Kaylin. It was this Vance Heiress character. Then I saw the letterhead, the Hawthorne Care Facility. I sat on a milk crate, the cold of the concrete floor seeping into my bones. My mind raced, trying to bridge the gap between my husband and a high-end nursing home. I dug deeper into the box and found a series of handwritten ledgers. Kaylin hadn't been consulting. He had been acting as a private estate manager for an elderly man named Mr. Sterling, a recluse who lived in a sprawling, crumbling Victorian on the edge of the Sound. According to the ledgers, Kaylin had been systematically siphoning funds from Mr. Sterling's accounts for over a year. He wasn't just helping Sloane. He was funding her entire lifestyle with the stolen life savings of a dying man. And Vance Heiress. Vance was the name of the lawyer Kaylin had hired to falsify the power of attorney documents. I felt a wave of cold fury so intense it made my vision blur. Kaylin wasn't just a liar or a mediocre husband. He was a predator. He had found a vulnerable person and was picking them clean, and he was using me, my credit, my home, my stability, as the perfect cover. Looking for something, Tamsin. I bolted upright, knocking a jar of screws onto the floor. They scattered like hailstones. Sloane was leaning against the garage door frame. She wasn't wearing the robe anymore. She was dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking blazer and dark jeans. Her migraine miraculously vanished. She held a steaming mug of tea, her eyes tracking the open metal box at my feet. "You really shouldn't poke around in Kaylin's things," she said, her voice dropping the airy lilt entirely. It was flat, clinical. "You might find things you aren't equipped to handle." "Is that what you call it?" I asked, standing up and holding the ledger. "Theft, elder abuse. Is that what I'm not equipped to handle, Sloane?" She didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her tea and stepped into the garage, the heels of her boots clicking on the concrete. "Kalen is doing what he has to do. We were drowning, Tamsin. Your freelance work barely keeps the lights on. He's securing our future. Yours too, if you just stay in your lane." By stealing from a dying man, by taking out insurance policies on me behind my back. I stepped toward her, the ledger trembling in my hand. "Who is Vance heiress, Sloane, and why is he the beneficiary of my life?" Sloane's expression didn't change, but her grip on the mug tightened. "Vance is a safeguard. Kalen is making sure that if anything happens, the money stays in the family, not with your distant cousins or some state tax collector." She moved closer, her perfume, that cloying, expensive floral scent, filling my space. "Don't be a martyr, Tamsin. You like this house. You like the fact that you don't have to worry about the mortgage. Just put the papers back, go inside, and let us finish this. Mr. Sterling doesn't have much time left. Once it's over, we'll be set for life. You, Kalen, and me." The way she said me, with such entitlement, such casual ownership of my marriage and my future, made the world tilt. "And if I don't," I whispered. Sloane smiled, and for the first time I saw the true depth of the malice she'd been hiding. "Kalen loves you in his way, but he loves me more. I'm the only one who really knows him. If you try to blow this up, you won't just lose him. You'll lose everything. We've made sure of that." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me in the shadows of the garage. I looked down at the scattered screws on the floor. I realized then that I couldn't just leave. I couldn't just call the police, not yet. They had spent a year building a paper trail that likely led straight to me. Kalen had been using my accounts, my signatures. I wasn't just the wife. In the eyes of the law, I was likely the primary accomplice. I needed to see Mr. Sterling. I needed to see the man my husband was killing with kindness before there was nothing left of him, or me, to save. The drive to the edge of the Sound felt like descending into a different century. The mist clung to the windshield, thick and salty, as the suburban sprawl gave way to towering Douglas firs and winding, unpaved roads. I found the address from the ledger, a Victorian manor that looked like it was being slowly reclaimed by the moss and the tide. I parked my car a block away, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. If Kalen found out I was here, the handling he'd promised Sloane would likely take a much darker turn. I walked up the gravel driveway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the damp air. The house was magnificent in its decay. Wraparound porches sagged under the weight of overgrown vines, and the gray paint was peeling away in long, skeletal strips. It was a house built for a legacy, now serving as a tomb for a man Kalen was erasing. I didn't ring the bell. I walked around to the side, peering through a window draped in heavy, yellowing lace. Inside, the room was clinical, a jarring contrast to the exterior. There were oxygen tanks, a hospital bed, and a small table cluttered with pill bottles. And there was Mr. Sterling. He was a shadow of a man, his skin translucent like parchment, propped up against a mountain of pillows. Sitting in a chair beside him, peeling an orange with practiced, delicate movements, was Kalen. I ducked back, my breath hitching. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at the mechanic. I pressed my back against the damp wood of the siding, listening. The window was cracked open, just a sliver to let out the smell of antiseptic. "You're doing great, Arthur." Kalen's voice drifted out, smooth, comforting, the exact tone he used when he told me he loved me. "Just a few more signatures on the estate tax forms. We want to make sure the foundation gets every penny just like you planned." The foundation. Mr. Sterling's voice was a dry rattle, barely audible. "My daughter, did she ever?" "No word, Arthur. I'm sorry," Kalen said, and I could hear the fake pity dripping from his words. "She hasn't returned any of the letters, it's just us. But don't worry, I'm looking after everything." I felt a surge of nausea. According to the files in the garage, Mr. Sterling's daughter, Marin, had been dead for 2 years. Kalen had the death certificate in his lockbox. He was keeping this man alive just long enough to bleed him dry, fueling his hope with a lie so cruel it made my skin crawl. Kalen stood up. I heard the scuff of his shoes. "I have to head out, Arthur. Tamsin's expecting me for lunch. I'll bring the notary by tomorrow." I scrambled away, staying low, and ran toward the tree line. I dove behind a massive, moss-covered cedar just as the heavy front door groaned open. I watched Kalen walk to his car, checking his watch, looking every bit the dutiful, busy professional. He didn't look like a man who had just spent an hour gaslighting a dying man. He looked satisfied. Once his car engine faded into the distance, I didn't go back to my vehicle. I went to the front door. I expected it to be locked, but it yielded with a soft click. Kalen was getting arrogant. He thought he owned the space. I stepped into the foyer, the air smelling of dust and stale peppermint. "Kalen," the rattle came from the back room. "Did you forget the pen?" I walked into the sick room. Mr. Sterling turned his head slowly. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but they sharpened with a flicker of confusion as he saw me. I wasn't the man he expected. "I'm not Kalen," I said softly, stepping into the light. I felt like an intruder, but I also felt a strange, protective heat rising in my chest. "My name is Tamsin. I'm his wife." The old man's hand, thin and trembling, reached out toward the air. "His wife," he said. He said he lived alone. He said he was a widower. I froze. Of course. Kalen had killed me off in his narrative to make himself more sympathetic, more devoted. He was building a life here that had no room for the truth. "He lied, Arthur," I said, sitting in the chair Kalen had just vacated. I looked at the orange peels on the table, vibrant and fresh in this room of dying things. "He's lied about a lot of things, and I think it's time we talked about your daughter." The old man's eyes welled with tears, a single drop tracking through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. "Marin, you know where she is." I looked at the pill bottles on the table. One was a sedative I recognized, high dosage. Kalen wasn't just managing his estate, he was keeping Arthur in a chemical fog. "I know the truth," I said, my voice gaining a hardness I didn't know I possessed. "And if you want to see justice for her and for yourself, you need to listen to me very carefully. We don't have much time." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the lace against the glass. I realized then that I wasn't just uncovering a crime. I was starting a war. And the first thing I had to do was find out who Vance Arris really was, because if he was the lawyer Kalen claimed, he'd be the one holding the keys to the trap they had set for me. But as Arthur reached out and gripped my wrist with surprising strength, he whispered a name that changed everything. "Vance," he wheezed. He was here this morning with Sloane." My heart stopped. Sloane wasn't just the sister, she was the partner, and Vance wasn't just a lawyer. He was her husband. The room seemed to shrink as the air grew heavy with the weight of Arthur's words. I looked at the fragile man in the bed, his grip on my wrist like a cold iron shackle. Sloane and Vance, not brother and sister, but a team. A couple. The sister-in-law I had shared my kitchen with, whose laundry I had folded, was a stranger playing a role in a long con performance. "What did they say to you, Arthur?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "When they were here together?" "They laughed," Arthur wheezed, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "They thought I was asleep. They talked about the house, my house. They called it a resale gold mine. And then the woman, the one Kalen says is his sister, she touched my locket, the one with Marin's picture. She said it was vile and outdated, and that she'd have it melted down once I was gone." A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The jewelry box, the locket. Kalen hadn't helped Sloane buy it. It was Arthur's. It was a piece of Marin's life that they had already begun to dismantle and distribute while the man was still breathing. I looked at the bedside table and saw a small, leather-bound journal tucked under a stack of medical bills. I reached for it, but the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway made me bolt upright. Kalen was back. "You have to hide," Arthur whispered, a sudden spark of lucidity in his terrified eyes. "The closet, go." I didn't hesitate. I ducked into the massive mahogany wardrobe at the back of the room, pulling the heavy door shut until only a sliver of light remained. The interior smelled of mothballs and stale wool. Seconds later, the bedroom door creaked open. "Arthur, sorry, forgot the insurance folder," Kaylin's voice boomed, but it lacked the warmth it had 10 minutes ago. It was impatient. "Why are you looking at the door like that?" I thought I heard a bird," Arthur stammered. He was a terrible liar, his voice shaking with a genuine fear that Kaylin seemed to mistake for senility. "Just a bird, right." I heard the rustle of papers. "Listen, Vance is coming by later to finalize the power of attorney for the Sound property. I need you sharp. No more forgetting who we are, okay? We're the only family you have left, Arthur. Remember that." "I remember," Arthur said, and the bitterness in his tone was so sharp I feared Kaylin would catch it. "Good." Kaylin's footsteps moved toward the wardrobe. My heart stopped. I pressed my back against the rear panel, my fingers digging into a wool coat. He reached for the handle, the metal clicked, but then his phone rang. "Yeah, Sloane, slow down," Kaylin said, his hand dropping from the door. He turned away. "What do you mean she's not at the house? Her car is gone. Did you check the GPS tag on the bumper?" My blood turned to ice. A GPS tag. I had been so focused on the papers that I hadn't even thought to check my own vehicle. They weren't just gaslighting me, they were tracking me like an animal. "Check the history. See if she went to the bank," Kaylin hissed into the phone, walking out of the room. "If she's trying to move the emergency fund, we're in trouble. I'll be home in 20 minutes. Just keep your cool." The door clicked shut. I waited until I heard his car gravel crunch away before I scrambled out of the wardrobe. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. "Tamsin," Arthur called out. I went to his side. He reached into the pillowcase and pulled out a heavy brass key. "The floorboard under the rug, my real journals, my daughter's letters. Kaylin thinks he found everything. He didn't." I knelt, pulled back the threadbare Persian rug, and pried up the loose board. Inside was a small metal box, identical to the one in Kaylin's garage, but this one felt honest. "Take it," Arthur said. "And Tamsin, don't go back to that house. They aren't just looking for money anymore. They're looking for a way out, and you're the only thing standing in their way." I took the box and kissed the old man's papery forehead. "I'm coming back for you, Arthur. I promise." I ran to my car, my mind spinning. I couldn't go home. If they had a tracker on my car, they knew I wasn't at the bank. They knew I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I looked at the GPS unit on my dashboard, the factory one. I realized I couldn't drive my car anymore. I pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot 3 miles away, left the engine off, and abandoned the vehicle. I hailed a taxi from a burner app I'd set up months ago for my freelance work. "Where to?" the driver asked. I looked at the metal box in my lap. "The public library," I said, "and then a locksmith." I needed to know what was in Arthur's box, but more importantly, I needed to see the face of Vance Arris. If he was Sloane's husband, he was the missing piece of the puzzle, the legal muscle behind the theft. As the taxi pulled away, I saw a familiar black SUV pull into the grocery store lot. It was Kaylin's. He stopped behind my empty car, and through the tinted glass, I saw him get out. He didn't look angry. He looked calm. He looked like a man who was about to clean up a mess. I realized then that the high-conflict hook of my life hadn't been the receipt. It had been the moment I decided to fight back. Because in their world, I was already dead. I was just a policy waiting to be collected. The library was a brutalist concrete fortress, a place where I could disappear into the stacks and think without the walls having ears. I found a corner in the back of the reference section, tucked between dusty volumes of maritime law, and placed Arthur's metal box on the table. My hands were trembling so violently, I had to sit on them for a full minute to make them stop. The lock was old, but the brass key Arthur had given me turned with a satisfying, heavy thunk. Inside weren't just letters. There were photographs. Most were of Marin, a woman with the same defiant set to her jaw that Arthur still carried. But at the bottom of the stack was a photo that made the air leave my lungs. It was a candid shot, taken at a garden party years ago. It showed a younger, darker-haired Sloane laughing, her arm looped through the man standing next to her. He was handsome in a sharp, aggressive way, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. I flipped the photo over. In elegant, looping script, it read, Sloane and Vance, Wedding Day, 2018. Vance Aris wasn't just a lawyer Kaylin had hired. He was the architect. This wasn't a brother-sister duo and a wayward husband. It was a triad of predators. They had likely been doing this for years, finding wealthy, isolated elders, inserting Kaylin as the caretaker and Sloane as the distraction, while Vance handled the legal erasure of the victim's life. And I was their perfect cover. The respectable wife who provided the domestic veneer that kept neighbors from asking questions. I opened the journal. Arthur's handwriting started strong but devolved into a shaky crawl. September 14th. Kaylin brought the sister today. She calls herself Sloane. She has my wife's eyes, but there is nothing behind them. They think I don't notice the pills. They think I don't hear them talking about the policy on the wife. Tamsin. I fear for that girl. She doesn't know she's the collateral. My heart hammered against my ribs. Collateral. I dug further into the box and found a folded piece of stationery from a local hotel. It was a note, written in Kaylin's distinctive, rushed hand, addressed to Vance. Vance, Tamsin is getting erratic. She found a receipt. We need to move the timeline up. If she goes to the police about the Sterling accounts, the insurance won't matter because we'll be in a cell. We do it Friday at the cabin. Make sure the accident looks like she was driving under the influence. I've already started planting the empty wine bottles in her trunk. I looked at the date on the note. Friday, that was 3 days away. The cabin was a remote property my father had left me, a place Kaylin always complained was too isolated to visit. Now I knew why he'd suddenly suggested we spend a reconnection weekend there to work on our marriage. I felt a cold, jagged resolve settle over me. I wasn't going to the police, not yet. With Vance's legal connections, the local precinct was likely a dead end, or worse, a trap. I needed to turn their own weapons against them. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank app. The $3,000 was gone. Kaylin had drained the account the moment he saw my car at the grocery store. I had $40 in my pocket and a box of secrets that would get me killed if I was caught with it. I stood up, leaving the metal box hidden behind a row of encyclopedias, taking only the note and the wedding photo. I walked to the library's public computer and typed in a name I had seen in Arthur's journal, a name Kaylin had told Arthur was unreachable. Detective Miller, the man who had investigated Marin's accidental drowning 2 years ago. If Marin hadn't just disappeared, if she had been their first policy, then Miller was the one man who might still be looking for the truth. But as I reached for the mouse, a shadow fell over the screen. You always did like the library, Tamsin. So quiet, so predictable. I didn't have to look up. The scent of wood smoke and expensive aftershave hit me first. Kaylin sat down in the chair next to me, his hand resting casually on the table, inches from mine. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were flat like slate. "Where's the box, Tam?" he asked softly. "Arthur told me you took it. Give it back and maybe we can still have our weekend at the cabin, just the two of us, like we planned." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You're not a fighter, you're a folder of laundry. Let's go back to that." Air in the library felt like it had turned to ice. Kaylin's hand was heavy on the table, a physical boundary I couldn't cross. For 7 years I had known this hand, the way it held a coffee mug, the way it rested on my hip while we slept. Now it looked like a weapon. "I don't know what box you're talking about, Kaylin," I said, my voice coming out thinner than I wanted. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the computer screen, which was still displaying the search results for Detective Miller. Kaylin followed my gaze. A small, dark laugh escaped his throat. "Miller, really, Tam? The man was forced into early retirement for obsessive tendencies 6 months ago. He's a drunk living in a trailer in Tacoma. He couldn't help himself, let alone you." He reached out and closed the browser tab with a slow, deliberate click of the mouse. "You think you're in a movie," he continued, his voice dripping with a patronizing pity that hurt worse than a blow. "The brave wife uncovering the dark secret, But you're just a woman who's been off her medication. That's what the police will hear. That's what the records at our family doctor already show. I turned my head then, looking him full in the face. What medication? I've never been on. I've been picking up your prescriptions for months, honey, he interrupted, his smile returning, the sharp, predatory one I'd seen in the garage. Antipsychotics, mood stabilizers. You've been so stressed, you see. Forgetting things, getting paranoid. It's a tragedy, really. Sloane has been so worried about you. He leaned in so close I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his irises. If you try to scream, if you try to run to that librarian, I'll just call the paramedics. I have the bottles in my pocket. I have the history. You won't go to jail, Tamsin. You'll go to a ward. And by the time you're clear-headed enough to tell your story, Arthur will be gone, the estate will be settled, and I'll be grieving on a beach in a country that doesn't care about your Seattle drama. He was right. They had been gaslighting the world, not just me. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen my sanity in the eyes of the law. Let's go, he said, standing up and gripping my upper arm. His fingers dug into the muscle, a silent warning. Sloane is waiting in the car. We're going home to pack for the cabin. We're leaving tonight. I looked around the library. A college student was dozing over a textbook 10 feet away. An elderly woman was browsing the mystery section. No one noticed the man lead-walking his fragile wife toward the exit. As we reached the heavy glass doors, my mind raced. I couldn't fight him physically. I couldn't outrun a car. But Kalen had one weakness, his arrogance. He thought I was a folder of laundry. He thought I was broken. I left the box at Arthur's, I lied, my voice shaking with a fake sob. I buried it under the azaleas by the porch. I was scared, Kalen. I didn't know what to do. He stopped, his grip loosening just a fraction. The azaleas. Yes, please, just take it. Take the money. I just want to go to my mother's house in Portland. I won't say anything, I swear. Kalen looked at me, searching for the lie. I let the tears fall, real tears, born of the sheer terror of my situation. He saw a defeated woman begging for her life. He saw the folder of laundry finally crumbling. Change of plans, he muttered, pulling out his phone and hitting a speed dial. Sloane, she hid it at the old man's place, under the bushes. No, I've got her, meet us there. We'll finish this at the Sound property, it's closer anyway. He shoved me toward his SUV. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I saw the empty wine bottles he'd mentioned, tucked into the footwell of the back seat, ready to be planted. I looked at the dashboard. My phone was in his pocket. My car was miles away. But as he started the engine, my hand brushed against something in my own pocket. The wedding photo of Sloane and Vance. And on the back of it, Arthur had tucked one more thing I hadn't noticed in my rush at the library. A small, high-capacity SD card from his security cameras. Arthur wasn't as senile as they thought, and I wasn't as helpless as Kalen believed. I just needed to get to a device that wasn't tracked, and I knew exactly where one was. The old Victorian's office, a room Kalen had never let me enter. You're making the right choice, Tam, Kalen said, reaching over to pat my knee. A quiet life in Portland. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Very nice, I whispered, clutching the photo in my pocket until the edges cut into my skin. We turned onto the road to the Sound, the mist swallowing the car. I knew then that only one of us was going to drive back out of those woods, and it wasn't going to be the man who thought he knew me. The drive back to the Victorian manor was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like being buried alive. Kalen drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the center console, ready to catch me if I made a move for the door. But I sat perfectly still, watching the skeletal trees blur past in the fog. I wasn't looking for an exit. I was looking for the precise moment to strike. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, Sloane's silver sedan was already there, idling near the sagging porch. She climbed out, her face a mask of cold impatience. The golden child act was gone. She looked sharp, dangerous, and utterly bored with the mess Kalen had created. Did you get it? She called out as Kalen killed the engine. She buried it by the azaleas, Kalen said, shoving me out of the car. He kept a firm grip on my wrist, leading me toward the side of the house where the overgrown bushes clawed at the foundation. "Start digging, Tam." "I need a trowel," I said, my voice trembling. "The soil is packed hard from the rain." Kalen cursed under his breath. "Sloane, keep an eye on her. I'll check the shed." This was the opening. I had perhaps 90 seconds. Sloane stood 3 feet away, lighting a cigarette, her eyes never leaving me. "You really are pathetic, Tamsin," she said, exhaling a plume of smoke into the damp air. "You had a comfortable life. All you had to do was keep your head down and keep the house clean. Now you're just an administrative hurdle." "Why did you marry him, Sloane?" I asked, kneeling by the bushes and digging my fingers into the cold, wet mud. I needed to keep her talking. "Vance, I mean, is he really that much better than Kalen?" The cigarette paused halfway to her lips. Her eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I saw the photo, Sloane. The wedding, 2018. I looked up at her, my hands covered in filth. "Does Kalen know that Vance is the one who holds the offshore accounts? Or does he think you're sharing everything equally?" It was a gamble, a pure shot in the dark, but I had seen the way Sloane looked at Kalen. She didn't respect him. She used him. Sloane took a step toward me, her face contorting. "You don't know what you're talking about. Vance and I have a partnership. Kalen is the muscle. He's the one who does the dirty work so we don't have to." "Then why is Kalen's name the only one on the forged power of attorney?" I lied, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If this blows up, Sloane, Vance is a lawyer. He knows how to disappear. You're his wife. But Kalen is the fall guy, and you're letting him think he's the mastermind." A flicker of genuine doubt crossed her face. In that split second, the heavy front door of the Victorian creaked open. "Kalen," Arthur's voice wavered from the doorway. He was leaning heavily on his walker, his face pale and sunken. "Kalen, the machine. It's beeping. I can't breathe." "Go inside and die, Arthur," Sloane snapped, turning her head toward the porch. That was it. I didn't dig, I lunged. I didn't run for the car. I ran for the porch. I collided with Arthur, nearly knocking the old man over, and shoved him back into the foyer. I slammed the heavy oak door and threw the bolt just as Sloane's weight hit the other side. "Tamsin, open this door," she shrieked. "The office," I gasped, grabbing Arthur's arm. "Where is the computer Kalen uses?" "Down the hall. The library," Arthur wheezed, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and sudden, fierce hope. I ignored the pounding on the door. I knew Kalen would be back from the shed in seconds, and a wooden door wouldn't hold him for long. I sprinted down the hall into the room filled with floor-to-ceiling books. On a massive oak desk sat a modern laptop, the only new thing in this house of ghosts. It was locked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the SD card. My hands were slick with mud, but I wiped them on my skirt. I didn't need the laptop's password. I just needed power. I looked at the side of the machine and saw the card slot. Click. The screen flickered. A file directory popped up, ChemSEC backup. I opened the first file. It was a video from 3 days ago. It showed Kalen and Sloane in Arthur's sick room. They weren't whispering. Kalen was holding a pillow over the old man's face, testing the weight, while Sloane laughed and checked her watch. "Not yet," she said in the video. "We need the insurance signature first." I felt a sob rise in my throat. It wasn't just a plan, it was a rehearsal. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of the house. Kalen was through the kitchen window. "Tamsin," his voice roared, echoing through the hollow hallways. It didn't sound like my husband anymore. It sounded like a man who had finally run out of patience. I looked at the screen. The upload bar for the cloud backup, the one I'd initiated the moment the card went in, was at 40%. I grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk. I wasn't a fighter, but I was cornered. And a cornered woman is the most dangerous thing in the world. "Arthur, hide in the pantry," I yelled. I stood behind the desk, watching the door. The footsteps grew louder, slow, and rhythmic. Kalen wasn't rushing. He knew I had nowhere to go. The door handle turned. "Tam," he said, stepping into the room. He was holding a heavy iron pry bar from the shed. He looked at the laptop, then at me. I really didn't want it to end like this. I wanted you to sleep through it. The video is uploading, Kaylin, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was trying to burst through my ribs. Every police station in the state is getting a copy of you trying to smother Arthur. It's over. He paused, his eyes flickering to the screen. 48%. He lunged. The desk was the only thing between us, a massive island of scarred oak. When Kaylin lunged, his weight hit the wood with a dull thud, the pry bar whistling through the air where my head had been a second before. It smashed into a stack of antique law books, sending clouds of yellow dust into the air. You think a slow upload is going to save you? Kaylin hissed, his face red and distorted. He vaulted over the corner of the desk with a terrifying, athletic grace I had forgotten he possessed. I scrambled backward, my heels catching on the heavy rug. I swung the brass letter opener blindly. The tip caught the sleeve of his flannel shirt, tearing the fabric, but it didn't draw blood. He didn't even flinch. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers crushing the bone until I felt my hand go numb. The letter opener clattered to the floor. You were always so focused on the truth, Tamsin, he snorted, twisting my arm behind my back. But the truth is whatever the survivor says it is. He slammed my face down onto the desk, right next to the laptop. My cheek pressed against the cool plastic. 56%. The blue bar was crawling, agonizingly slow. Sloane, get the car around to the back, Kaylin shouted toward the hallway. We're taking her now. Kaylin, stop. The voice didn't come from Sloane. It came from the doorway. Arthur was standing there. He wasn't using his walker. He was leaning against the doorframe, his chest heaving, clutching a heavy silver-plated trophy, an old rowing award from his youth. His eyes weren't clouded anymore. They were burning with a cold, ancient fury. Kaylin froze, his grip on my arm loosening just a fraction. Arthur, get back to bed. You're having a delusion. I see you, Kaylin, Arthur whispered. I see the boy who thought he could steal a dead girl's memory. Kaylin laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You can barely stand, old man. What are you going to do, bleed on me? He turned back to me, reaching for the laptop to rip the power cord out. But that 1 second of distraction was all I needed. I drove my elbow back into his ribs with every ounce of strength I had left. The air left his lungs in a sharp wheeze, and I tore myself away from his grip. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the heavy velvet curtains draped over the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pulled the cord with a violent jerk. The afternoon light flooded the room, but more importantly, the sudden movement startled Sloane, who was peering in through the glass from the porch. She saw me. She saw Kaylin doubled over, and she saw the laptop. Kaylin, the police, she screamed through the glass. There's a cruiser coming up the drive. Kaylin bolted upright, his eyes widening. What? No, it's too soon. I looked at the screen. 72%. Sloane didn't wait for him. I heard her heels sprinting across the gravel, the roar of her engine ignited a second later. She was doing exactly what I'd predicted in the garden. She was saving herself. Sloane, wait, Kaylin roared, stumbling toward the window. He watched as her silver sedan tore down the driveway, fishtailing in the mud and disappearing into the mist. He was alone. He turned back to me, the pry bar still clutched in his hand. The desperation in his eyes had turned into something feral. You did this, he whispered. You destroyed everything. You did this the moment you bought that locket, Kaylin, I said, backing toward Arthur. I put my arm around the old man, feeling the fragile heat of his body. You thought I was part of the furniture. You forgot I was the one who kept the house standing. Kaylin raised the bar, his knuckles white. He looked like he was going to swing, regardless of the consequences. But then, the sound of real sirens began to wail in the distance. Not a lie from Sloane, but the actual response to the silent alarm Arthur had triggered from the panic button in his pocket. The one Kaylin had told him was broken months ago. Kaylin dropped the bar. It hit the floor with a hollow clang. He looked at the laptop. 98%, 99%, upload complete. Tamsin, he said, his voice suddenly cracking, returning to that soft, manipulative tone that used to make me melt. Tam, listen to me. I did it for us. I did it so we could have a life. Please, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them Arthur is confused. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years. I looked at the sawdust on his shirt and the lies in his eyes. I'm done folding your laundry, Kaylin, I said. I walked over to the laptop, closed the lid, and tucked it under my arm. I led Arthur toward the foyer, leaving Kaylin standing in the center of the rotting library, surrounded by the ghosts of the man he tried to kill. As we reached the front door, the blue and red lights began to dance against the mist. I felt a strange, cold peace. The story wasn't over. There were lawyers to face, a sister-in-law to find, and a life to rebuild from the ash. But for the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. The aftermath was not a whirlwind of cinematic arrests and shouting. It was a slow, quiet unraveling, as muffled as the Seattle fog. I sat on the damp porch steps of Arthur's house, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket an officer had given me, watching as they led Kaylin out in handcuffs. He didn't look like a mastermind or a predator anymore. In the harsh, oscillating glare of the police lights, he looked small, a middle-aged man in a dusty flannel shirt who had gambled his soul on a life he hadn't earned. He didn't look at me. He kept his head down, his shoulders slumped in that same tired worker posture he'd used to deceive me for years. It was his final performance, but there was no one left in the audience. Detective Miller, who was not, as it turned out, a drunk in a trailer, stepped out of the house, snapping his notebook shut. He walked over and sat on the step beside me. He smelled of old coffee and cedar. The backup on that SD card was the final nail, Tamsin, he said softly. But the financial records we found in the trunk of your husband's car, that's what's going to lead us to Vance Heiress. We picked up Sloane at a gas station 10 miles north. She was already trying to call a lawyer in Grand Cayman. And Arthur? I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. He's being taken to the hospital for observation, but honestly, the paramedics say his vitals are better than they've been in weeks. I think the anger did him some good. Miller looked at me, his eyes weary but kind. You saved him. You know that, right? I was saving myself, I whispered. He just happened to be holding the door open. A month later, I stood in the guest room of my house, the house I was now preparing to sell. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets. It was the hollow, clean silence of an empty vessel. I had spent the morning packing Sloane's things into cardboard boxes. I found a silk scarf she'd borrowed from me, a bottle of expensive perfume she'd stolen from my dresser, and a stash of letters from Vance hidden in the lining of a suitcase. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. Their story was written in the court documents piling up on my kitchen table. Kaylin was facing charges of elder abuse, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit murder. Vance and Sloane were being tied to 2 other estates in Oregon. The triad was broken. I walked into our bedroom, my bedroom, and sat at the vanity. The mahogany jewelry box was still there. I opened it and looked at the velvet lining. It was still empty. I realized then that I didn't want it filled with heirlooms or emeralds. I wanted it to stay empty, a reminder of the space I had cleared in my own life. I picked up my phone. There was a message from Arthur. He had moved into an assisted living community near the water, a real one, with gardens and a view of the Sound. The azaleas are blooming, Tamsin. Marin would have liked them. Come for tea when the world stops shaking. I smiled, a small, genuine thing that felt heavy on my face. I looked at the folded laundry on the bed. I had folded it out of habit, the neat squares of towels and linens a testament to the woman I used to be. I took the stack, and instead of putting it away, I dropped it into a donation bin. I wasn't a folder of laundry anymore. I was the woman who had walked through the fog and found her way home. I walked out of the bedroom, leaving the door open. I went downstairs, picked up my car keys, the ones to the new car, the one without a tracker, and stepped out into the Seattle rain. It felt cold, sharp, and perfectly real. I didn't look back at the house. I just drove.